Welcome. This is the Drupal usability meeting for February 4th, 2022. I'm Benji Fisher moderating, and also at the meeting are Michael, who's sharing his screen, Erin McHale, Maria Pimentel, Marina Victoria, Offer Schall, Ralph Kohler, Thomas Howell, and Thiago. Thank you all for coming. I see we have a couple of new people here. If you haven't been at the meeting before, then please give me your Drupal.org username, either in the Slack chat or in the Slack channel, and I can give you credit for attending the meeting. I don't think any of us are actual usability experts, but what we do have is a fair number of people with different backgrounds, and I think that's really helpful for usability discussion to have the different points of view. So Michael, why don't you discuss the issue you're looking at now?
Okay, thank you very much, Benji. So let me roll to the top of this issue. So
for the sake of the recording, what's the issue number?
So this is issue number 315-0294. Okay, so this issue is about the translations of moderated nodes not being created in the initial workflow. And this has gone through quite some time, and now it's up to the final stage where we need the user experience team to make a decision on what the wordings for the buttons are, which is over here. So should I go through the whole backstory of this issue?
Yeah, give some context for people who haven't looked at the issue before.
Okay, so the issue is when general users, they want to make a multi-language sites, they make use of content moderation and content translation modules. When this is enabled and having two roles, which are the author and admin, and while the workflow is being set up, as we see over here, the draft, the need review state, and published. And once the author has created the node in English and he sets it into needs review, this would be okay. But once the author wants to add a new translation for this node, then because the original state of this language in English was set in needs review already, so this would cause an invalid error message saying that this transition is not able to be saved. So this new translation can't be created. And while this logic is correct, this permission is, they don't have the permission to do. So they had this kind of discussion over the backstory. I think that's the briefing of this issue. Yeah. So at the end, what they have gone through was they have created a new logic to allow people who enabled both the content moderation module and the content translation module. Once both of the modules are created, they would show this form under the workflow settings, which is over here. And that allows people to decide how they would want their new translation moderation state to be set once the new translation is being added. And here I have a working example. This is the same. This is the default form of the workflow settings. And once the patch has been created, has been patched, sorry, then we will be able to see this form under there. And now what Derek needs is for us to discuss what wordings would be better for users to understand the second button, which is this one, the legacy behavior. So what legacy behavior does is once this button is being chosen and saved, whenever a new translation is created, it can only be set to published or draft states, while the default moderation state will still follow the original settings above. Is there any questions?
Okay, so I don't mind going first. I like the default moderation state because it ties it directly to the thing that's up there above. So I think that is good. I think initial moderation state when adding a new translation. I think that's okay. I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a content creator or a site builder, if that would make sense, but I suppose it would. The only thing I'm sort of like not sure in is the words legacy behavior. I don't know if that implies, like, does that imply it's going to be deprecated and removed at some point, or is that just what we're calling it because that's what it used to be?
I don't understand. I don't think there was a used to be. It was a whole new naming, a wording for this button. So originally they said it as current moderation state of original content, which is quite confusing. So Derek, he altered it as legacy behavior. And like you said, it sounds, it feels like a deprecated function, but currently it isn't.
Why not just simplify it? Could you go back to that, please?
Sorry. Right. Okay.
Why not just simplify it to published or draft, depending on the current moderation state of original content? But I don't know that you need legacy behavior either. If you're just choosing between two modes, those three words seem superfluous.
You mean to remove this?
The legacy behavior either. So you get rid of those three words and just have it be published or draft, depending on the current moderation state of the original content.
Okay. And you're saying that because this is not a deprecated function, but an add-on.
It's not even an add-on. Like in theory, you could have a third radio button choice. There could be another way of choosing this, and someone could do that in custom or contrib. This is just two options. One is using, I mean, I'd almost say default moderation state set, or like default moderation state. I'm assuming most people will see and think the drop down above. And I know that using directional words is useless. Like, we should not do that. It's bad for your accessibility. But the second one, legacy behavior, is essentially meaningless because legacy to what?
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't, like, either is an unnecessary word as well. So published or draft, and then If we can simplify the following words, I would do that as well. But essentially, the second choice is saying published or draft, and it has a dependency on its source content. And so that's all it needs to be. So at most, everything minus the 3 first words, or additional wordsmithing to shorten the sentence afterwards. And I defer to everyone else on the call, but legacy to behavior definitely doesn't belong. Because what happens when you have whatever the default moderation state becomes the new legacy? Do you have legacy and ad nauseum? It's just not a great thing to put in content.
I see. Okay.
Ralph, did you want to make a comment?
Yep. I agree what Thomas said with removing legacy behavior either, and also shortening the sentence. But on the other hand, I consider it quite confusing. Let's take the case you have default moderation state draft. Me as a user, at first, I see default in the initial moderation statement, adding new translation. I have the option default moderation state. First, I have to check what was the default moderation state. I have to go up and check was the draft. Okay, then one radio button is draft, and the second radio button is publish or draft again. So that would make me stumble as a user, to be honest. I'm not sure if it could be eased in some way.
Agreed. I also wanted to point out, you'd mentioned that content creators would see this. I don't believe this form would be visible to content creators. I think it's only site builders.
Oh, right. You're correct. This form will only be available for site builders. And additionally, I would like to add the behavior when setting this button from a program view. So if I may show this part. So this is the existing code, which is done. So when they choose the legacy part, the legacy behavior does is that they check if the entity is not new, they would set it either to publish or draft, just like the wordings. By deciding whether, by judging on the condition of this entity. Right.
Sorry, can you go back to that for a sec?
Okay.
So, okay, so if it's a publishable entity and it's not new, so basically, if it's okay, so if it's not new and it's already published, then just publish. Otherwise, set it to draft.
Right.
So, because I was looking at that form and I was thinking, what decides? Like, if you go back to the screenshot now, so when it says publish or draft depending on the current moderation state of visual content, my next question would be, is if I hadn't seen that code, I would be like, what decides whether it's published or draft? So I think either rewording this option to just be explicit about exactly what's going to happen, or adding it as like more help text. Because a site builder would want to know under what conditions is it going to be draft, or under what conditions is it going to be published.
Aaron, I think you hit on really good wording accidentally when you were describing it. I would state it as set to published unless, or set to published if source node published, otherwise set to draft or otherwise draft. Like that's translating what the code's doing. And we can wordsmith that further, but the idea being we're setting it to published and that's the default unless it's not published. And then it's only set to draft. And default moderation state, you could modify slightly to say something like set to default moderation state or set to chosen moderated set to chosen default moderation state or something that's like it matches the actions in both of them.
Can it just be set to published if not draft?
It's not that it's if not draft, it's if it's anything other than published, it becomes draft.
Oh,
But
Okay.
only if it's not new, because if it's a new piece of content, I actually don't know what happens because, well, I presume nothing. I presume if it's a new piece of content, there isn't any translations. So I suppose that's irrelevant because a new piece of content wouldn't have any additional translations yet. So
It's just checking
Yeah.
for the flag published. It's basically saying if flag is set to 1 for published, then make a translation published. If flag for published is set to null, or not null, to 0, then set to draft.
Okay, so like, if the original content is published, set moderation state to published. Otherwise, set it to draft or something like that.
Yeah, hopefully simpler because I started getting too wordy there, but
Yeah, there's a lot of words going on here. That's the problem as well. There's a lot of specific words to deal with here too.
Yep.
okay.
But
And
In general, we want to keep the text as short as possible, and then we have to balance how explicit we are, how much information we convey, with the disadvantage of just overwhelming people with too much information. So we're going to have some sort of compromise here between a complete explanation of how the code works and something, you know, the shortest we might have is publish or draft and not say anything more. Well, that's really too little information. So we need some happy medium between the two.
But I wonder, would it also possible for the first option, default moderation state, to dynamically add the default moderation state that the user doesn't have to look upwards and just has the two options right next to each other? First, for example, draft default moderation state, and on the second, the wording that has to be chosen yet as still. But to make it more explicit, default moderation state is kind of open, in my humble opinion.
In the background here, sorry, Ralph, I just wanted to ask if I can't remember because I'm working on a wording just now, but is there a drop down to set what the published state is, like which moderation state is published? I can't remember if that is the case.
should I show the form?
Yeah, that may help.
So you were saying the drop down over here.
I'm just looking for where does it get published from? I can't remember if that's is that defined somewhere what the published state is?
Oh,
Scroll up a little further,
okay.
and you'll see that the draft and published can't be removed. They can be
Oh,
edited, but they can't
right.
be removed. So those two states are always
Oh.
there.
Okay, this is confusing as well because if the default if you scroll back down, right? So, okay, so that the initial moderation state is set to draft, right? In
Right.
this area, that's configurable, but draft is actually like assumed to always be the draft. Like content moderation that says draft and published are states that will always be here. They're the start and the end. So like this was throwing me off a bit because I was trying to think, yeah, technically initial moderation state is says it behind. But it's also, this is really weird because why would draft, if you can set, presumably draft is the initial moderation state, so but you can overwrite that. So why is draft not, like, why is that hard coded?
Why is it hard coded where?
Well, it's like it's a state. Draft and published are clearly ones that are like content moderation is like these states are going to exist, and draft is the start state and published is the end state. But then why is draft? Why is the initial moderation state configurable? Or is that the initial moderation state? That's the default. Okay, that's the default moderation state.
And to confirm, this is the default moderation state for translations, correct?
This is the default moderation state for any new content with or without translations.
Okay, and adding the translation adds in the new form in your second tab. And it changes that existing workflow settings to look like.
So adding, when enabling the translation, content translation module, the current patch would create this second options on that form. So that when people wanted to create new translations, but while they're on a non-default state, which they created by themselves, which is needs review in this context, then they would bump into this this error message saying that they can't create a new translation from needs review to needs review.
Now, some site might want to have published as the default state, and maybe they've added archived or other states that come after something is published. So there are certainly use cases where you'd want the default moderation state to be published rather than draft.
Right. So it's up to the site builder or the users.
Right, because draft relates to content not being published.
The thing that I had been confused about that I'm now getting, I believe, or understanding, I believe, is that I thought this was specific to translations, but you don't have the ability to set one default moderation state for the main language and a second moderation state for translated languages. So that's where my confusion had come in. I thought this was on the translation. I thought this was on some translation form. I wasn't realizing this was just part of the workflow moderation. And the reason for that is in the event where English language on our website, you would want that to always go to draft as the default moderation state. But if you were you clicked a button, created a translation, you'd want that to go to the draft language queue because it's different editors. You wouldn't have the English editors editing a foreign language. And so just to me, the wording of the second initial moderation state, I thought we actually got to choose two different moderation states, but it looks like this is either you're just reverting, you're using whatever all the base states are, or you're triggering off of something that doesn't allow you to do that. So you're ignoring what you're setting And so this could be set to draft 2, and draft 2 would be a created moderation state. And then the legacy behavior would put it in published or draft, depending on whether or not it was already published or in a draft state. So I guess behaviorally, this works a lot different than I had thought. And it wasn't immediately clear when I was looking at this. And maybe it's because we're looking at just this screen more rather than seeing it in context.
Right, sorry.
Oh, no apology necessary.
So I think the main focus that Derek wanted was he needed to have a confirmation on how this wording should be displayed so that it won't be that confusing, even though this may be a future deprecated function or behavior. Because when sorry, but I misread over here, but he said that this is a legacy behavior, right? Which is why he used the wording, but maybe it's still very confusing for general users.
Right. So it is true that that is the current behavior before this patch goes in, but then is that useful information? Does the site builder need to know that that's the way it used to work before Drupal 9.4? And I think, when we started this discussion, we pretty much agreed that it's not useful information, that we don't need to tell the site administrator that this is the way it used to work.
Right. So we would remove these 3 words.
Right.
Okay.
So I would actually like to propose an alternative solution here, because now that we have a clearer understanding here, fundamentally, the problem we're trying to solve is allowing the site builder to set a behavior that won't result in content creators getting error messages when they when they're creating a translation. And I wonder if adding a second dropdown that said something to the effect of default, like initial moderation state for new translations, and it's just a drop down like the default moderation state, and it lets you pick which one. I wonder if that is a better way to solve this problem, because then you could set it to draft, or you could set it to published, or you could set it to whichever moderation state is the one that they should be set to. And I'm not sure if that creates more problems or if it solves the problem, but
no, Aaron, that's not an option, because we have to allow sites to continue using the current behavior. We can't just remove that option. Where we're giving, what we are doing now in this patch is giving them a new option, but we're still allowing them to keep the legacy behavior.
I think isn't that the same? Wouldn't they still? Hold on.
See, what I'm starting to think, if we're really narrow in our goal, if there's a legacy behavior, the default should be for now to the legacy behavior until there's a major upgrade. So that right now the default radio button is on default moderation state. And if sites that have things installed are already using the legacy behavior, that should be the one that is chosen until such a point that it is deprecated. And so we don't need the words legacy behavior either, but it should be the chosen state with the option of moving to the default moderation state. And then with a major revision change, I don't know which module you'd key off of. But with a major change, then you default to using the default moderation state. And I would change the wording for default moderation state to use default moderation state. And the other one would be used, published, or draft, depending on, or a simplification of the words after published or draft. Default moderation state is very confusing to me because it doesn't connect that you are choosing to use the default state for all content when you're talking about translations. And the legacy behavior, if that's what we're trying to continue to maintain, if someone turns off the module, someone disables or uninstalls the module and reinstalls the module, we would be switching from legacy behavior to the new moderation state, and there would be no notification of that change. So if we want to maintain parity, we should be starting with the published or draft and giving them an option of improving to using the default moderation state.
I think that's a pretty unusual use case. I don't think we really have to worry about someone who disables and then re-enables the module and preserving their, basically preserving their settings when they do that. I also think that that's a question that's out of scope for usability. You know, if you're interested in this issue, you're free to comment on it for any other points, but for the meeting, I'd like to focus on the usability question, which is how do we make these two options clear? How do we best inform the site builder?
The reason
how to choose between the two options.
The reason I disagree with you on that fact is usability is not just wordsmithing. Like the what option is being automatically selected is part of usability.
I presume there's just like an update hook that keeps the behavior. I'm looking at the patch. It's a big patch, but I presume there's an update hook that just keeps sets the legacy behavior for existing installations.
I believe so. I mean, the point of this issue is that the legacy behavior is buggy. It leads to these error messages when, in certain circumstances, when adding a translation. And I think that's a strong argument for making the new default something that won't generate error messages. And if I remember correctly, the last time we discussed this, Thomas, you were the one who was saying that we shouldn't make the legacy option available, that we should always use the default moderation state. And you now seem to be taking the other side.
I'm taking the other side right now simply because I had misunderstood last time that default moderation state was not specific to, like, what's stuck in my craw is the fact that initial moderation state, like, it just wouldn't be clear to me that was being added. Maybe the issue is it doesn't belong in that workflow settings tab, and it needs to be a separate thing that says, with helper text saying this is here because you've enabled translation. But it's conflating the translation module and the workflow module in a setting just for the workflow module. And I don't know why that would appear, and I don't know why I would make this choice. And the default moderation state, all it's choosing is to set the code to avoid the error message using the default moderation state, which is superior, but I had thought that we were setting this specifically for translations. And we're not, there's never a choice for what default moderation state to set for translations. That actually is not a part of this at all. And that's why I had conflated or combined, I'm sorry, the fact that default moderation state that you're choosing is for translations. That's what it reads to me like.
I'm sorry, what do you think is not clear?
What's not clear is that you aren't choosing, you can never choose to use a different moderation state for translations. I read this as you're choosing what moderation state to use for translations, but you aren't. You don't have that variability. It's a third radio button or a missing option. And that's why I got very confused. And so the word default moderation state, you're actually just defaulting to the default moderation state. You're never able to choose something else. And adding the translation information as a site builder reads like you do have a choice. And the answer is no, you don't. You're either using a legacy behavior or you're using the same state as all other content. So there isn't an option for translations. It's just confusing to me.
So you do have a choice. You don't have free choice. You can't choose some fourth or fifth state as the initial state for translations. You're limited to
I understand that
options,
walking through it.
one of which involves two states.
Right. And I'm saying I understand that after we've talked about it for 30 minutes, but reading this form, it gave me a completely different impression. Because I'm seeing translation and I thought that, oh, okay, I go above, I change draft. So imagine a world where I created a new moderation state called translation draft. I would have come in here, picked translation draft, and suddenly all of my normal content is going to translation draft because we're talking about two different things in this same area. And it just cognitively, I understood it to mean that I was choosing the state for translation. Where you're not choosing the state for translation, you're choosing to either use the default state for all content or to use a legacy behavior.
So how could we make that clearer?
We could change the wording on default moderation state to use the default moderation state used for all content. Something along those lines. It just makes it clear that you aren't choosing the translation moderation state, because I kept on reading that second line and thinking that's what the draft drop down above was for.
Or would it be an idea to extend it? I'm not a native speaker, but default moderation state for all languages?
Yeah.
All installed languages or something like that?
That would also work very, very well.
Right, because if you actually that does work, because when you have if your site is multilingual, English isn't a special case, it's just another language.
Yes, correct. And you actually would change the wording above. So when the translation module is installed, where the first instance of default moderation state is in the default workflow module, I would change that wording to say default moderation state for all languages right there. And that kills my confusion very quickly. And you can use that same language in the first radio button, and then we can quash my confusion at minimum.
So would you start that with use default moderation state for all languages?
You could, or you could say, yeah, I'm fine with whatever everyone else. I was just trying to figure out how to fix the confusion that I was getting, because there was dissonance between the two.
So how about when content translation is enabled, instead of changing the label default moderation state, suppose we add another sentence to that help text, clarifying that this applies to, or clarifying what new content means. That new content means something that is not a translation of an existing.
That would be fine as well,
piece of
but
content.
it needs to be like before the select the state. I would have like in square brackets or something that said for all languages, something that, because if it's buried in this in the paragraph or the multiple sentences, I've seen too many times where I or other people don't get to that.
Yep.
Putting it up front makes it clear that there's been a state change in this form. And that is a reasonable alternative to default moderation state.
So I just posted what it might look like if we changed all the labels in the chat.
So you're suggesting default moderation state for all languages. So that would be the new label near the top of the form. And then 1, use default moderation state for all languages, and 2, published or draft depending on the current moderation state of the original content.
Yeah, so that just drops the first 3 words.
I would recommend changing original to source content or source node. Simply because original implies the first time that something was created. That's a minor quibble, but source is more specific.
So we also went round on actually what it's doing. So maybe it's hold up.
And the main reason I'm so energized about this topic is I haven't dealt specifically with translations, but I've been in similar situations as site builder where I've had real problems with confusing like statements where it led to a really profoundly different understanding of what the UI was doing. And I'm trying to make certain that we get this one right because it's pretty important, it seems.
So there's an updated version, which basically takes what the code is doing. So use publish state if the source content is published, otherwise use draft state or something to that effect.
I like all of this a lot. I would go along with Benji's recommendation that we not change default moderation state and instead put that into the helper text.
Okay.
I think that kind of allows us to minimize changing the form much further. Does that fit with what you were suggesting, Benji?
I'm not sure that I've suggested anything except vaguely that we add to the help text rather than change the labels.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Michael, you put into the chat default moderation state. I'm not sure what.
That was a mistype. Sorry.
Yeah, maybe adding to the help text is better because we probably don't want to be changing the form labels.
But usually the form labels are the text that is in most cases scanned only, and people orient to that more. So yeah, I'm not sure. I feel the label or the headline to the select box default moderation state with the asterisk to add the for all languages there is, I consider it more clear somehow. And it would make the use default moderation state underneath shorter and also clearer in combination with the second the use published state if source content is published suggestion.
I have a slight preference for just using nouns in the drop-down list rather than sentences. So if we drop the first three words in the second option and say published or draft, then if those are nouns, that's good. And that's consistent with the first option, which is default moderation state.
Yeah. So it would be. I think that's what I had. So anyway, so it could be do publish state if the source content is published, otherwise draft state, or just draft, or do we drop the word state or add moderation state? Publish moderation state if the source content is published, otherwise draft moderation state.
I think we can have published or draft states based on the current moderation state of the current content.
Yeah, I think the problem we visited with the sentence as it's written there is it's not clear under what conditions something would be set to published or something would be set to draft. And a site builder can't just go and look at the code to see what it's doing. So we have to make that clear in the interface under what conditions.
Right.
So that's why I think being clear about like basically saying that it's published if the original content is published, otherwise it will be draft.
Again, keeping it short is usually a good idea. And I think as long as it's italicized, we can just refer to it as published, the single word, or draft, the single word. We don't have to say published state. So using Aaron's suggestion, I would say something like published italicized if the source content is published, otherwise draft italicized.
I'm gonna write that. I'm gonna use forward slashes too, because Zoom chat doesn't have like, you know, formatting.
Okay.
Wait, would you say otherwise draft if, I don't know if we should spell this out, but how does this look? I feel like I had it shorter earlier. Hold on.
Oh,
That kind of works.
strike the last part. Just otherwise.
Oh, otherwise draft.
Stop.
Yeah. Okay. So published if source content is published, otherwise draft.
I think that's quite good. It's quite short and concise.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think it's also, as I said, clear as to like what conditions would trigger published or draft.
Mhm.
Would it be possible even to drop content and just say published if source is published, otherwise draft?
I wonder, maybe, I'm not sure if it's then too ambiguous as to what source is referring to.
True.
Because at least with the word content, you know it's referring to the piece of like content.
Or it should say source language.
Or if translation source is published.
Oh, actually, so the label above it, initial moderation state when adding a new translation, default moderation state, published if source content is published, otherwise draft, published if source is. Maybe we can drop content because you still have the context of like the label above. Like initial moderation state when adding a new translation kind of puts you in that frame of like, oh, this is when I'm adding a new translation to a piece of content.
Mhm.
And the one below it just says default moderation state, which refers to the thing above.
What if we changed the label to something like initial moderation state when translating existing content, and then use the phrase existing content in this option?
Okay. So that would be like published if existing content or like existing source.
I think there's only one source language to be translated, because that would be the default language.
Yeah,
Okay.
but the point is we have a node in some language that is already there, and then we are translating it. And I'm suggesting that we use the same words to describe that original content in both the label and the option.
Right.
okay.
So basically this then. So
Initial moderation state when translating existing content. And the second option is published if existing content is published, otherwise draft. I like that.
That's good.
yeah, I'm trying to find a way to be mad at it, but I can't.
So we
Just a-
only have a few minutes left. We have to wrap this up. I'd still like to, if we can, come up with some way to help clarify the confusion that Thomas described. But I think this is a good step forward. We should certainly post a comment to this effect on the issue. Michael, do you think you can post that comment, or would you like someone else to do it?
Yes, I can do that. So,
Okay.
And just to clarify, because we've spent an hour talking about this, what was Thomas's problem again?
It was not clear to him the two things that we're selecting here, the default moderation state and the state for translations, it wasn't clear to him which each of those applied to.
Okay.
So I guess the phrase new content in the help text just isn't explicit enough. Maybe that's the crux of the issue.
I feel like this is such a thorny, there's a lot of words here that perhaps that could be addressed in a follow-up issue or even later in the issue, but like I feel like it's just that we've got to a better place now, at least for this meeting.
I think so.
Yep.
And Michael, I'll give you a suggestion in Slack for how you can refer to the usability issues so that people can find the recording of this meeting if they want to.
Oh, okay, thank you.
So thank you all for attending. This was slow, hard progress, but this is an issue that's been hanging around for a while, and I know that a lot of people are happy to finally get this issue fixed, and we've helped move it along. And we'll do this again next week. I hope many of you can make it. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. I've posted the text in Slack as well.